For a moment the entire crowd was utterly still. Then applause began here and there, and suddenly united everyone around us. The lights rose in the sconces on the walls, and heads turned to one another, conversation erupting all around. A woman rising in the middle of a row to pull her fox fur sharply from the chair, though no one had yet made way for her. Someone else pushing out quickly to the carpeted aisle, and the whole body was on its feet as if driven to the exits. But then the hum became the comfortable, jaded hum of the sophisticated and perfumed crowd that had filled the lobby and the vault of the theatre before. The spell was broken. The doors were flung open on the fragrant rain, the clop of horses' hooves and voices calling for taxis. Down in the sea of slightly askew chairs, a white glove gleamed on a green silk cushion. I sat watching, listening, one hand shielding my lowered face from anyone and no one, my elbow resting on the rail, the passion in me subsiding, the taste of the girl on my lips. It was as though on the smell of the rain came her perfume still, and in the empty theatre I could hear the throb of her beating heart. I sucked in my breath, tasted the rain, and glimpsed Claudia sitting infinitely still, her gloved hands in her lap. There was a bitter taste in my mouth, and confusion, and then I saw a lone usher moving on the aisle below, righting the chairs, reaching for the scattered programs that littered the carpet. I was aware that this ache in me, this confusion, this blinding passion which only let me go with a stubborn slowness would be obliterated as if I were to drop down to one of those curtained archways beside him and draw him up fast to the darkness and take him as that girl was taken. I wanted to do it, and I wanted nothing. Claudia said near my bowed ear, "Patience, Louis, patience." I opened my eyes. Someone was near, on the periphery of my vision, someone who had outsmarted my hearing, my keen anticipation, which penetrated like a sharp antenna even this distraction, or so I thought. But there he was, soundless beyond the curtained entrance of the box, that vampire with the auburn hair, that detached one, standing on the carpeted stairway looking at us. I knew him now to be, as I'd suspected, the vampire who had given me the card admitting us to the theatre. Armand. He would have startled me, except for his stillness, the remote, dreamy quality of his expression. It seemed he'd been standing against that wall for the longest time, and betrayed no sign of change as we looked at him, then came towards him. Had he not so completely absorbed me, I would have been relieved he was not the tall, black-haired one. But I didn't think of this. Now his eyes moved languidly over Claudia with no tribute whatsoever to the human habit of disguising the stare. I placed my hand on Claudia's shoulder. "We've been searching for you a very long time," I said to him, my heart growing calmer, as if his calm were drawing off my trepidation, my care, like the sea drawing something into itself from the land. I cannot exaggerate this quality in him, yet I can't describe it and couldn't then, and the fact that my mind sought to describe it even to myself unsettled me. He gave me the very feeling that he knew what I was doing, and his still posture and his deep brown eyes seemed to say that there was no use in what I was thinking, or particularly the words I was struggling to form now. Claudia said nothing. He moved away from the wall and began to walk down the stairs, while at the same time he made a gesture that welcomed us and bade us follow. But all this was fluid and fast. My gestures were the caricature of human gestures compared to his. He opened a door in the lower wall and admitted us to the rooms below the theatre, his feet only brushing the stone stairway as we descended, his back to us with complete trust. And now we entered what appeared to be a vast subterranean ballroom, carved, as it were, out of a cellar more ancient than the building overhead. Above us the door that he had opened fell shut, and the light died away before I could get a fair impression of the room. I heard the rustle of his garments in the dark, and then the sharp explosion of a match. His face appeared like a great flame over the match, and then a figure moved into the light beside him, a young boy, who brought him a candle. The sight of the boy brought back to me in a shock the teasing pleasure of the naked woman on the stage, her prone body, the pulsing blood, and he turned and gazed at me now, much in the manner of the auburn-haired vampire, who had lit the candle and whispered to him, "Go." The light expanded to the distant walls, and the vampire held the light up and moved along the wall, beckoning us both to follow. I could see a world of frescoes and murals surrounded us, their colors deep and vibrant above the dancing flame, and gradually the theme and content beside us came clear. It was the terrible triumph of death by Brugal, painted on such a massive scale that all the multitude of ghastly figures towered over us in the gloom. Those ruthless skeletons, ferrying the helpless dead in a fetid moat, or pulling a cart of human skulls, beheading an outstretched corpse or hanging humans from the gallows. A bell tolled over the endless hall of scorched and smoking land, towards which great armies of men came with the hideous, mindless march of soldiers to a massacre. I turned away, but the auburn-haired one touched my hand and led me further along the wall to see the fall of the angels, slowly materializing with the damned being driven from the celestial heights into a lurid chaos of feasting monsters. So vivid, so perfect was it, I shuddered. The hand that had touched me did the same again, and I stood still despite it, deliberately looking above to the very height of the mural, where I could make out of the shadows 2 beautiful angels with trumpets to their lips, and for a second the spell was broken. I had the strong sense of the first evening I had entered Notre Dame, but then that was gone, like something gossamer and precious snatched away from me. The candle rose, and horrors rose all around me. The dumbly passive and degraded damned of Bosch, the bloated coffined corpses of Triani, the monstrous horsemen of Dürer, and blown out of all endurable scale a promenade of medieval woodcut, emblem and engraving. The very ceiling writhed with skeletons and mouldering dead, the demons and the instruments of pain, as if this were the cathedral of death itself. Where we stood finally in the center of the room, the candles seemed to pull the images to life everywhere around us. Delirium threatened. That awful shifting of the room began, that sense of falling. I reached out for Claudia's hand. She stood musing, her face passive, her eyes distant when I looked to her, as if she'd have me let her alone. And then her feet shot off from me with a rapid tapping on the stone floor that echoed all along the walls, like fingers tapping on my temples, on my skull. I held my temples, staring dumbly at the floor in search of shelter, as if to lift my eyes would force me to look on some wretched suffering I could not endure. Then again, I saw the vampire's face floating in his flame, his ageless eyes circled in dark lashes. His lips were very still, but as I stared at him he seemed to smile without making even the slightest movement. I watched him all the harder, convinced it was some powerful illusion I could penetrate with keen attention, and the more I watched, the more he seemed to smile, and finally to be animated with a soundless whispering, musing, singing. I could hear it like someone curling in the dark, as wallpaper curls in the blast of a fire, or paint peels from the face of a burning doll. I had the urge to reach for him, to shake him violently so that his still face would move, admit to this soft singing, and suddenly I found him pressed against me, his arm around my chest, his lashes so close I could see them matted and gleaming above the incandescent orb of his eye, his soft, tasteless breath against my skin. It was delirium. I moved to get away from him, and yet I was drawn to him, and I didn't move at all, his arm exerting its firm pressure, his candle blazing now against my eye, so that I felt the warmth of it. All my cold flesh yearned for that warmth. But suddenly I waved to snuff it out, but I couldn't find it, and all I saw was his radiant face, as I had never seen Lestat's face, white and poreless and sinewy and male. The other vampire, all other vampires, an infinite procession of my own kind. The moment ended. I found myself with my hand outstretched, touching his face, but he was a distance away from me, as if he'd never moved near me, making no attempt to brush my hand away. I drew back, flushed, stunned. Far away in the Paris night a bell chimed, the dull golden circles of sound seeming to penetrate the walls, the timbers that carried that sound down into the earth like great organ pipes. Again came that whispering, that inarticulate singing, and through the gloom I saw that mortal boy watching me, and I smelled the hot aroma of his flesh. The vampire's facile hand beckoned him, and he came towards me, his eyes fearless and exciting, and he drew up to me in the candlelight and put his arms around my shoulders. Never had I felt this, never had I experienced it, this yielding of a conscious mortal. But before I could push him away for his own sake, I saw the bluish bruise on his tender neck. He was offering it to me. He was pressing the length of his body against me now, and I felt the hard strength of his sex beneath his clothes pressing against my leg. A wretched gasp escaped my lips, but he bent close, his lips on what must have been so cold, so lifeless for him. And I sank my teeth into his skin, my body rigid, that hard sex driving against me, and I lifted him in passion off the floor. Wave after wave of his beating heart passed into me, as, weightless, I rocked with him, devouring him, his ecstasy, his conscious pleasure. Then, weak and gasping, I saw him at a distance from me, my arms empty, my mouth still flooded with the taste of his blood. He lay against that auburn-haired vampire, his arm about the vampire's waist, and he gazed at me in that same pacific manner of the vampire, his eyes misted over and weak from the loss of life. I remember moving mutely forward, drawn to him and seemingly unable to control it, that gaze taunting me, that conscious life denying me. He should die, and would not die. He would live on, comprehending, surviving that intimacy. I turned. The host of vampires moved in the shadows, their candles whipped and fleeting on the cool air, and above them loomed a great broadcast of ink-drawn figures, the sleeping corpse of a woman ravaged by a vulture with a human face, a naked man bound hand and foot to a tree, beside him hanging the torso of another, his severed arms tied still to another branch, and on a spike this dead man's staring head. The singing came again, that thin, ethereal singing. Slowly the hunger in me subsided, obeyed, but my head throbbed and the flames of the candles seemed to merge in burnished circles of light. Someone touched me suddenly, pushed me roughly, so that I almost lost my balance, and when I straightened I saw the thin, angular face of the trickster vampire I despised. He reached out for me with his white hands, but the other one, the distant one, moved forward suddenly and stood between us. It seemed he struck the other vampire, that I saw him move, and then again I did not see him move. Both stood still like statues, eyes fixed on one another, and time passed like wave after wave of water rolling back from a still beach. I cannot say how long we stood there, the three of us in those shadows, and how utterly still they seemed to me. Only the shimmering flames seemed to have life behind them. Then I remembered floundering along the wall and finding a large oak chair into which I all but collapsed. It seemed Claudia was near and speaking to someone in a hushed but sweet voice. My forehead teemed with blood, with heat. "Come with me," said the auburn-haired vampire. I was searching his face for the movement of his lips that must have preceded the sound, yet it was so hopelessly long after the sound. And then we were walking, the three of us, down a long stone stairway deeper beneath the city. Claudia ahead of us, her shadow long against the wall. The air grew cold and refreshing with the fragrance of water, and I could see the droplets bleeding through the stones like beads of gold in the light of the vampire's candle. It was a small chamber we entered, a fire burning in a deep fireplace cut into the stone wall. A bed lay at the other end, fitted into the rock and enclosed with 2 brass gates. At first I saw these things clearly, and saw the long wall of books opposite the fireplace, and the wooden desk that was against it, and the coffin on the other side. But then the room began to waver, and the auburn-haired vampire put his hands on my shoulders and guided me down into a leather chair. The fire was intensely hot against my legs, but this felt good to me, sharp and clear, something to draw me out of this confusion. I sat back, my eyes only half open, and tried to see again what was about me. It was as if that distant bed were a stage, and on the linen pillows of that little stage lay that boy, his black hair parted in the middle and curling about his ears, so that he looked now in his dreamy, fevered state like one of those little androgynous creatures of a Botticelli painting. And beside him, nestled against him, her tiny white hand stark against his ruddy flesh, lay Claudia, her face buried in his neck. The masterful auburn-haired vampire looked on, his hands clasped in front of him, and when Claudia rose now, the boy shuddered. The vampire picked her up gently, as I might pick her up, her hands finding a hold on his neck, her eyes half shut with the swoon, her lips rouged with blood. He set her gently on the desk, and she lay back against the leather-bound books, her hands falling gracefully into the lap of her lavender dress. The gates closed on the boy, and, burying his face in the pillows, he slept. There was something disturbing to me in the room, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't, in truth, know what was wrong with me, only that I'd been drawn forcefully either by myself or someone else from 2 fierce, consuming states, an absorption with those grim paintings, and the kill to which I'd abandoned myself, obscenely, in the eyes of others. I didn't know what it was that threatened me now, what it was that my mind sought escape from. I kept looking at Claudia, the way she lay against the books, the way she sat amongst the objects of the desk, the polished white skull, the candle-holder, the open parchment book whose hand-painted script gleamed in the light, and then above her there emerged into focus the lacquered and shimmering painting of a medieval devil, horned and hoofed. This bestial figure looming over a coven of worshipping witches. Her head was just beneath it, the loose curling strands of her hair just stroking it, and she watched the brown-eyed vampire with wide, wondering eyes. I wanted to pick her up suddenly, and frightfully, horribly, I saw her in my kindled imagination flopping like a doll. I was gazing at the devil, that monstrous face preferable to the sight of her in her eerie stillness. "You won't awaken the boy if you speak," said the brown-eyed vampire. "You've come so far, you've travelled so long." And gradually my confusion subsided, as if smoke were rising and moving away on a current of fresh air, and I lay awake and very calm, looking at him as he sat in the opposite chair. Claudia, too, looked at him, and then looked from one to the other of us, his smooth face and pacific eyes very like they'd been all along, as though there had never been any change in him at all. "My name is Armand," he said. "I sent Santiago to give you the invitation. I know your names. I welcome you to my house." I gathered my strength to speak, my voice sounding strange to me when I told him that we had feared we were alone. "But how did you come into existence?" he asked. Claudia's hand rose ever so slightly from her lap, her eyes moving mechanically from his face to mine. I saw this and knew that he must have seen it, and yet he gave no sign. I knew at once what she meant to tell me. You don't want to answer. Oh, sorry, that's Armand. You don't want to answer, said Armand, his voice low and even more measured than Claudia's voice, far less human than my own. I sensed myself slipping away again into contemplation of that voice and those eyes from which I had drawn myself up with great effort. Are you the leader of this group? I asked him. Not in the way you mean, leader, he answered. But if there were a leader here, I would be that one. I haven't come, you'll forgive me to talk of how I came into being, because that's no mystery to me. It presents no questions. So if you have no power to which I might be required to render respect, I don't wish to talk of those things. If I told you I did have such power, would you respect it? He asked. I wish I could describe his manner of speaking, how each time he spoke he seemed to arise out of a state of contemplation, very like that state into which I had felt I was drifting, from which it took so much to wrench myself. And yet he never moved, and seemed at all times alert. This distracted me, while at the same time I was powerfully attracted by it, as I was by this room, its simplicity, its rich, warm combinations of essentials, the books, the desks, the 2 chairs by the fire, the coffin, the pictures. The luxury of those rooms in the hotel seemed vulgar, but more than that, meaningless beside this room. I understood all of it except for the mortal boy, the sleeping boy, whom I didn't understand at all. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Okay, so that's another section of Interview with the Vampire. What stuff do we have going on today? The first thing I think to talk about is that as Louis and Claudia are brought down into the bowels of the theatre by Armand, it's interesting to note that these images of death that were so present within the play continue down into the bowels of the theatre, because that theatre, the sort of backstage area, essentially, where the vampires live in a coven, is not somewhere that the mortal audience would have access to. And I think the fact that this notion of death, deathly imagery, death triumphant, that kind of thing, going on down into the very bowels of the theatre reinforces the notion I brought up yesterday, where this imagery of death is not just about sending a message to the mortal audience. It is very much about serving as a moral reminder and framework to the vampires that live in the theatre. It's this base message on which they found their moral structure, as all the vampires before have done. They've created this moral structure for themselves in order to justify the actions they commit. And in their case, it's this notion of them as conscious death, and that they can act indiscriminately in killing, and that killing is something that they have a right to do almost as death incarnate, essentially. You already know my opinion on that moral structure, but I think that's what they have framed themselves around here. And although they employ religious imagery heavily, I think that, as we'll get into very soon, they have a very secular outlook in this regard. Similar to Louis, but not exactly the same. Another cool thing that we have in this little section is the boy who serves the vampires. He is a vampire fetishist, essentially, who willingly allows the vampires at the theatre, and clearly any visiting vampires, to feed on him, as he is capable to withstand. And he receives very clear and explicit sexual gratification from the feeding. I'm sure, as you were listening to my description, it was very clear that he was enjoying himself quite a deal at what was happening to him. And this does a couple of things. I think the first thing this shows is that it solidifies the feeding as sex analogy that I've been going over and over in this text. I don't think that analogy needed much solidifying. I think it was pretty solid to begin with based on the descriptions. But in case you needed it, I think this description here just completely confirms the relationship that between vampire and victim that is represented in the feeding within this text, and within a lot of vampire texts, to be honest. And it provides us an interesting perspective where it gives us something of the mortal perspective on this feeding, where it's revealed to be a very, very pleasurable thing to be fed on by the vampire. Another thing that this does is that it shows us out and out very readily that vampires are able to feed off of mortals without killing them. We kind of knew this already because of what happened to Claudia, but it was spoken about as though it were an exception. But no, it does just appear to be the case that vampires can feed off of mortals and then remove themselves and allow that mortal to recover and continue to live. So, killing a mortal from a vampire's perspective is purely a matter of choice and pleasure, essentially. Like, the ultimate reason why vampires kill mortals in this text appears to boil down to it feels good, and so we try to justify it through other ways, which is why they have this whole death incarnate, motif going on. And obviously, it's still wrong for them to feed off mortals and not kill them. It's wrong for a couple of reasons, at least the way it's presented here. The first reason is because vampires can feed off of animals. They can survive off of animals, so that is, I think, I would normally consider this not contentious whatsoever, but I understand there are some people who might not entirely agree with me, the notion that vampires can feeding off animals is infinitely more moral than them feeding off humans. But in my personal view, I think it's pretty obvious that feeding off of an animal is a more moral act than feeding off of a human. There's room for disagreement there, but it's what I believe, and it's, I think, what a majority of people would believe. I think it would be a very, very small percentage of people who would disagree with me on that. But the second thing it suggests is that... the second thing that is implied here is that I doubt the relationship that these vampires have with this boy is particularly healthy. Every vampire-mortal relationship we've seen throughout this text has been founded off of obsession and building unhealthy obsessions and using that as a foundation for abuse. So I doubt there's much different going on here, especially when this boy is being done tangible bodily harm very regularly. I don't think it matters much that he is enjoying it if he is only enjoying it because he's being manipulated and entranced by these vampires. It's not proper consent in that regard, I don't think. So that's another problem that this presents for the morality of, feeding off humans and not killing them. However, it is still better than what they pretend they have to do. It's still better for them to be doing this than actually killing mortals on the regular. It just serves ultimately to prove again that vampires are big sad hypocrites, and they really, really want to pretend they have to kill people, but in reality it's just that killing people makes them feel good and powerful and vampy. Regardless, I think I've said that enough times throughout this reading, and I'll probably say it a few more before I'm finished, but it's an important theme to the book, and I need to address it every time it comes up. We have a confrontation between Santiago. I was right about his name. He is called Santiago. Where Santiago clearly wants to confront Louis, probably kill Louis, but he is stopped by Armand. What this does is it again reasserts Armand's sort of somewhat authority over the other vampires of this coven. We see also Armand exerting his authority on stage when he appears to kind of surprise Santiago by appearing on stage. We could almost suggest that he went off script in arriving, and that Santiago had actually intended to be much more cruel in his killing of the woman. Not that it matters to me, it's still killing regardless. But what this Armand kind of taking this fascination with Louis, it suggests a few things to me. The first is that he's seen something in Louis which interests him. And, there's hints at that thus far, and we're going to hear more about that as the text progresses. And I also think there's a degree of Armand probably being a bit more reserved and, I hazard to say, sensible than Santiago. He's much more interested in hearing Louis out and seeing what he has to say, as opposed to just killing him when he arrives. And why vampires would want to kill Louis currently, given the situation they perceive. Well, the first is obviously the notion that they're just territorial. That's a potential option. But I also think Claudia has a lot to do with this, and that's mentioned very soon, so we'll deal with that as it comes up. But as a very base notion, you can kind of understand the assumptions that are being made by people like Santiago when they see Louis traveling along with a child vampire. The assumption would obviously be that he has made her, which he kind of has. And also he's basically a pedophile. Not explicitly, he does have the she's actually 100 years old defense to go to, but it ain't good when we consider the sexual implications of feeding and the fact that he is traveling with a child. I've talked about this a lot, but you get what I mean here. Anyway, the final thing I want to talk about here relates back to Armand's authority. And we have this notion of Armand leading the coven, but kind of tenuously leading the coven. He says himself that if there was a leader, that would be me, but there isn't officially. So he holds this position of authority in kind of an informal way. And the reason for this informal leadership appears to be predicated on his age and his strength. So the thing that gives him authority is the fact that he is the oldest and most powerful vampire there. And what I think this suggests is it highlights the kind of individualistic, predatory attitudes of the vampire. This notion that the only authority they're willing to acknowledge is force. And I think this individualism that the vampires present is very fitting in the kind of capitalistic metaphor that they go along, where they're operating in the society purely based around personal gain and personal interest, and as such, the only thing that can convince them to cooperate in any manner is force and those with greater power than them. And so they're acting in interest. And in a way, there's this capitalist metaphor to them too. But they've also essentially become these kind of undead egoists, acting purely in personal interest. It feels like every single vampire that we've seen thus far in the text, with the exception of not really even the exception of Louis towards Claudia. Louis's kind of an exception here. He seems to think differently than the other vampires, but even he appears mainly focused on personal interest above all else. And the only interest in the preservation of other people appears to arise when that person can benefit them in some way or provides them with pleasure in some way. Not perfect when applied to Louis, because Louis does occasionally act against that, but all the other vampires, I feel, are always acting in this egoistic manner of my pleasure is the only thing that matters in the universe because nothing means anything, and so I should just do what makes me feel good. Anyway, that is my analysis for today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be back again tomorrow with another 10 pages of Interview with the Vampire, so I'll see you then.